I give the call to the most honourable member for Dunkley.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. Closing the gender pay gap is important for women. It's important for women to be valued as equal, to be remunerated as equal, to be considered the equal of men. But closing the gender pay gap is about more than making sure women are paid and valued fairly. It's also about men, it's about businesses, and it's about community. I'm the first woman to ever represent Dunkley in the federal parliament, something that, thank you very much, Member for Lindsay, it's something that I'm very proud of. My electorate, Dunkley, as many people have heard me tell before, is named after a woman called Louisa Dunkley. So I'm even prouder to be the first woman to represent an electorate named after a woman who was a worker, who was a feminist and was a unionist, and at the turn of the last century campaigned for equal pay for men and women in the Victorian Post and Telegraph Office, and then took that campaign nationally when Australia became a country after federation, and campaigned for women and men in the brand new Commonwealth Post and Telegraph Office to receive the same pay for the same work. It seems almost obvious to most of us in 2023 that two people sitting next to each other doing the same work with the same qualifications at the same standard should be paid the same, but that wasn't the case for much of Australia's history, and it certainly wasn't the case when Louisa Dunkley worked in the Post and Telegraph Office. She almost single-handedly is responsible for the fact that the Commonwealth Public Service Act of 1902 had a provision in it for the equal pay for men and women in the Commonwealth Post and Telegraph Service. But Louisa didn't see equal pay as just about women. She saw it about something more. And one of the few pieces of her writing which was renowned as brilliant and insightful, and which changed many people's minds on the subject of work and women and equality, one of the few remaining pieces of her writing that made it through a fire at the Union headquarters in the early 1900s, she said this: "Though at first we only asked for equal pay as an act of justice to those women who had been doing the same work as men, we now advocate it as the only solution as to how to keep up the value of work and provide fair opportunities for employment of both men and women in the future." Closing the gender pay gap is about fairly remunerating women and valuing the work of women, providing women fair opportunities in the workplace, but it is also about valuing the work, because the work itself isn't gendered, and the gender of the person doing the work shouldn't dictate the value of it and how much people are paid for doing it. Like many women in this parliament, perhaps some men too when they talk about the gender pay gap, but like many of the women that talk about the gender pay gap, I often get emails from constituents saying, "What gender pay gap? It doesn't exist. It's unlawful to pay men and women differently in Australia." They're right about one thing: it is unlawful to pay men and women differently in Australia based on their gender now. But they are very wrong when they say there is no gender pay gap. I mean, it's currently a gap of about 13.3%, reported by the Workplace Gender Equality Agency in February of this year. It had been stuck at about 20% for quite some time, and there has been a reduction, in part because of a long period of stagnation of wages and suppression of men's wages, particularly in higher paid industries such as mining, which closed the gender pay gap without actually increasing pay for women, partly because of some of the reforms that have been brought in by successive governments over the last 2 decades or so. So it is now down to 13.3%. But what that means in practice is for every dollar a man earns, a woman earns 87 cents. It's based on a calculation of average weekly ordinary earnings. So women's average weekly ordinary earnings across all industries and occupations are $1,653, and men's average ordinary full-time earnings across all industries is $1,907, a gap of $253.50 a week. That's the gender pay gap. That's women being valued less in the workplace, women getting less promotions than men. Because, of course, what that calculation, average weekly ordinary full-time earnings, doesn't take into account is bonuses, overtime payments, superannuation. The Workplace Gender Equality Agency estimates that the gender pay gap is about 5% worse if you take those things into account. And what the gender pay gap also doesn't take into account is what happens when you look at part-time and casual workers who often work in the lowest paid industries and who are often women. Because the other thing we know is that feminised industries are the lowest paid industries in this country and are almost exclusively, but not exclusively, care industries, where people are engaged in work that traditionally was done at home, caring for children, caring for elderly, caring for sick who can't work, people with disabilities, and was done by women and was unpaid and undervalued. And now that it is done in a professional sense, it remains predominantly carried out by women and underpaid and undervalued. So this legislation is just one of the measures that are intended to encourage businesses to be conscious of the way they are paying their staff, to be conscious of the way they are deciding who gets a promotion and who doesn't, to be conscious of the way bonuses and overtime are paid. Not all decisions which favour men over women are done consciously. Unconscious bias is something that we are all subjected to. It is human nature often that people favour those who remind them of themselves, which is often subconsciously. So in many workplaces, traditionally, and it remains the case today, when the upper executive are men, often men from one socio-economic group, and often white men in this country, they choose to promote or to have join them in their ranks other men, or to employ men who remind them of themselves at a young age. Not necessarily because they are doing it in a conscious sexist manner. Sometimes probably, yes, and we've all lived through examples of that, but often because of this unconscious bias. And if you never take account of the pay gap between men and women in your organisation, if you never do an audit of men and women at senior ranks and extend that to talk about men and women from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds or people with disability, then you often don't know that actually your workplace reflects only one group of people. So legislation like this, which asks businesses to consciously audit the pay across genders and to report it, is a way to overcome both the conscious and the unconscious bias, the systemic discrimination which still exists in this country. A country where a man in his early 20s has more chance of being a CEO of an ASX-listed company than a woman in her 50s. And what it does is help to send a signal from that business and to that business that equality is important and that women's work and that women are as valuable as men. And I'd like to think, in the vein of Louisa Dunkley, that it also sends a signal about the value of work. It's about valuing the people that do the work, and it's about valuing the work. I want to just finish by giving what I think is a very concrete example of the impact of the gender pay gap and feminised industries being lower paid, and some of the structural barriers about women being able to have children and continue to work, which we haven't worked out quite how to overcome yet with flexibility. Last week I was part of a forum held by Pink Hope, which is an organisation to provide support and assistance to women who have a high chance of having breast cancer, and to promote assistance for women with rarer types of breast cancer. So this forum was about women who have triple-negative breast cancer, which means that this type of cancer they have is not receptive to any type of hormone, doesn't feed off a hormone, which makes it much harder to treat than hormone-receptive positive breast cancers. It's a particularly diabolical type of breast cancer, triple-negative breast cancer. It is not only harder to treat, it occurs most frequently in women under the age of 40. And the mortality rate for women with triple-negative breast cancer is astronomically higher than for women with hormone receptor positive breast cancers, and much more likely to be metastatic when it's found. And the forum was talking about treatment, because we're at the state at the moment with treatment for triple-negative breast cancer where it really needs to be very targeted. And as I understand it, in my layperson's scientific understanding of it, the best targeted treatment at the moment hasn't been through our system in Australia and approved by PBAC yet. So it costs tens of thousands of dollars to be able to access it. And it is being prescribed to women, particularly young women with triple-negative breast cancers, with some success, but they can only get it if they can afford to pay $20,000. But what this forum really took the lid off was the fact that it was inequality of financial resources that was also impacting these women. So it's bad enough in a country like Australia that if you're from a certain suburb or wealthy, you can afford $20,000 for a treatment, and if you come from a more working class area and don't have access to funds, you can't, and this person's life will be longer and somewhat better than this person's. But when you add that to being a woman around about 40 or under the age of 40, at a peak time where probably just taken time out of the workforce to have children, at a peak time when haven't had the promotions that get the money that men often get. They work in feminised industries which are lower paid and have less superannuation to draw on. This medical issue becomes a gendered issue because women can't afford to pay for the medicine. I think that is a terrible example, but an example of why closing the gender pay gap, of lifting the pay for women in feminised industries, of lifting the ability of women to work and have families is so crucial, as well as making sure our health system means that people can access the care that they need. Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for Dunkley